minutes on the timer, go ahead and do so. I want you to imagine if America today had a similar policy stance that it had in the early 1900s, a time when we hadn't yet gone through World War I or World War II, where organizations like NATO, the UN, or the EU did not exist, and a time where America had minimal economic ties with foreign nations. If America continued to maintain this stance today, we would only be a shell of the nation that we are right now. Judges, this is not a thought experiment, but it's exactly what's happening in American ports and rivers right now. American ports are critical to connect businesses with consumers in the United States. Yet a law more than a century old significantly stunts American ports' ability to expand and grow, which in turn harms families and businesses. It's because of this problem that Mark and I advocate for the resolution that the United States federal government should substantially reform its policy towards one or more countries in Europe. Now, before we get into the crux of our case, there's one important term that I would like to define. You can write this down as our definition of dredging. Again, that's dredging. The process of dredging is explained by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in January of 2023. Quote, dredging often is focused on maintaining or increasing the depth of navigation channels, anchorages, or berthing areas to ensure the safe passage of boats and ships, end quote. And so an easy way to think of the process of dredging is a big ship that's basically operating like a bulldozer or an excavator that's pushing out the built-out sedimentation in our port. And the process of dredging is vital because if we do not dredge our ports properly, cargo ships cannot enter in effectively. But as we'll be seeing in our first background point, the process of dredging is substantially restricted in the status quo. Background point 1, you can write down as the Foreign Dredge Act of 1906. Again, the Foreign Dredge Act of 1906. Over 100 years ago, our country signed the Foreign Dredge Act that banned all foreign countries from participating in dredging operations in American ports and rivers. This comes from Nicholas Lewis in 2019. He said, quote, the Foreign Dredge Act of 1906 prohibits any foreign built or chartered ships from dredging in the U.S. The result is to exclude the world's largest dredging companies that could provide better and cheaper service for dredging projects at the behest of a few politically connected companies, end quote. Now, lacking a proper alliance or international organizations at the time, the America of 1906 just simply wasn't situated to deal with foreign presence in the U.S. market. However, it no longer has any legitimate application in 2023, especially considering that it's imposing severe harm on our economy. This leads us to background point 3, which is American dredgers can't handle projects. Again, American dredgers can't handle projects. We'll see this from former U.S. Ambassador Howard Gutman and 16 other contributors in 2020. Quote, although supporters of the U.S. industry tout that there are more than 50 American dredging companies, only a handful of American companies have a dredge large enough to enable them to bid on and handle these major port projects. This gets worse whenever we consider subpoint A, which is America working at full capacity. Again, America working at full capacity. We'll see this for the Deputy Director for the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies, Nicholas Lewis in 2019. Quote, a lack of maintenance on dredging and increasing ship depth has left U.S. harbors functioning at full channel depth and width only 35% of the time. At times, port authorities say they have asked for bids on dredging projects, but no American dredgers can respond. They are operating at full capacity, end quote. Because our industry is inadequate, our ports are not being maintained, even though our port authorities are asking for projects. Meanwhile, our allies overseas in Europe traverse the world completing dredging projects in every continent, but are not able to dredge the United States because of this archaic law. Thus, my partner and I present our plan. Our mandate is to exempt European countries allied with the U.S. from the Foreign Dredge Act and any other supporting legislation to allow them to bid in U.S. dredging contracts and to transport dredged material in U.S. waters while following U.S. environmental, safety, and liability requirements. However, all dredging contracts will be offered to U.S. companies first and will only be made available to foreign companies once U.S. dredging companies have had the opportunity to accept contracts first. This will ensure that existing contracts with U.S. companies are maintained while allowing all U.S. ports to receive appropriate dredging maintenance. Enforcement of this plan is through Congress, the President, and any other agency. Funding is not required because the plan is purely legislative. And finally, the plan begins at the next fiscal year. Now, there are 3 justifications or reasons why you should be siding with this plan, starting with justification 1, which is most important dredging projects neglected. Again, most important dredging projects neglected. We'll see this from President and CEO of Organization for International Investments, Nancy McLaren, in 2019. Quote, today, only a handful of U.S. seaports can accommodate the most modern transport ships, which are 1.5 times as large and can carry twice as much cargo as the typical vessel that may export in America. At least 10 of America's busiest ports must expand to remain competitive with foreign ports. But the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers estimates that this will take far more than a decade. The article goes on to say that, quote, the problem is that the U.S. dredging companies simply aren't capable of meeting demand. The 4 largest free market dredging companies, all based in Belgium or the Netherlands, could complete the U.S. projects for half the estimated cost and a third of the time if Washington simply allowed them to compete, end quote. From this evidence, we see 2 things. First, we reaffirm the fact that our U.S. capacity isn't enough to meet vital demand. But secondly, we can see that our allies are the best in the world, conducting 90% of dredging operations worldwide. But you might be asking yourself the question, why should I care that our ports aren't being dredged? This leads us to justification 2, which is crushing the supply chain. Crushing the supply chain. We'll see this from Jackie Benson, writing for the Joint Economic Committee about the Foreign Dredge Act in 2022. Quote, this law discourages port expansion by making dredging more costly. And the high cost of dredging is the primary reason why the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach are the only ports currently large enough to fit many of vessels that transport goods into the United States. The inability of container ships to offload at other ports was a key contributor to the container ship backlogs, delays, and supply chain-driven inflation experienced throughout 2021 and into 2022, and continues to act as a barrier to efficient supply chains today, end quote. Now, all of you have probably noticed that virtually everything in our economy has gotten more expensive recently. Maybe you've even gone to the store looking for certain products, but you couldn't find them because they were simply unavailable. And to be clear, there's 100 different reasons why inflation and shortages happen in our economy. But as this evidence points out, a key contributor to this problem is the fact that our ports aren't being dredged and how that is crushing our supply chain. But to show you the economic impact of this, will bring me to justification 3, which has cost millions of jobs and billions of dollars. We'll see this from Gregory Torsi, who's an international trade attorney and legislative counsel for the U.S. Senate in 2021. Quote, ships now land from weeks on the coast of California to load and unload cargo because America cannot make other ports deep, wide, or modern enough to handle standard cargo ships. The situation drastically increases the cost of American exports, and with it, the U.S. balance of the trade deficit. An estimated 1.6 million jobs have been lost in America because of this problem. But to show you how this is possible, we're reading to subpoint A, which is 1 port, 50 billion lost. This comes from the same author, Gregory Torsi, in 2021. It says, quote, the Port of Corpus Christi uses $50 billion of oil exports a year, or 1 billion barrels annually, because the greatest country in the world cannot dredge the port, end quote. Just because the U.S. refuses to allow European allies to collaborate on dredging projects, it costs our economy millions of jobs and billions of dollars every single year. Hopefully I've shown you that maintaining the Foreign Dredge Act of 1906 in its current form today in 2023 is an irresponsible policy that is having too much on our economy today, and for these reasons we ask for it. Thank you. I'll now turn over the process.
First of all, could I see the evidence you read?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. And then I'd like to start on your plan.
Yeah.
I believe your plan was talking about a clause where the Europeans can't enter the market. Could you explain that?
Yeah, so basically the way our plan works is that any contract that's put out and that's able to be accepted by a U.S. company, that will be given to the U.S. company. The Europeans aren't going to be able to compete on that. Okay, however, whenever there's a contract that's put out that can't be accepted and bid on by a U.S. company, we'll open those up to European competition to fulfill that demand.
So how much time does the U.S. have before Europeans gain access to this?
Yeah, generally it's not an issue of time, because what happens is oftentimes is that the U.S. industry is already working at full capacity. The USACP knows when this is happening because it's impossible for them to bid on any extra contracts.
Okay, and how many contracts did the USAs give out last year?
I believe it was around 390 contracts.
Okay, and can we agree that the majority of these contracts are smaller inland projects and not coastal areas, correct?
Sure, like there's 360 ports in the United States, and I admit that a lot of those are small projects, but as the evidence in the NITOC points out, there are ports such as Corpus Christi, which is a super important port for our economy that is not dredged.
And then can we agree that dredging is paid for by 2 actors, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and sometimes a private port authority, correct?
Yeah, generally it's about half.
can we agree that a lot of times these agencies have to plan out their budgets in advance of the year, correct?
Sure.
Okay. And how long do companies have when the bid is advertised and then when the bid date closes? Like, how long do they have to bid on that contract?
I guess whatever, the USACE basically puts out the bid, and there's an expiration date on the bid that's determined by the USACE. I don't know if there's a specific amount of time for every contract, it's just a blanket rule, or it might be something that's determined on a case-by-case basis by,
Okay. Now I'd like to look at some of the numbers you were talking about. You were first talking about how 35% of the ports are operating at full capacity. Where did Nicholas Lors get this number from?
I'm not sure where he got that number. I would also like to point out that that wasn't the point of that evidence. The bigger point we saw in that evidence was that our port authorities are asking for bids, but we're not able to get them because we're operating at full capacity.
Okay. And then you were referring to the high cost of dredging as the primary reason why LA and Long Beach are fully dredged, correct?
Sure, that's what the evidence said.
Okay. Can we agree that a company doesn't have to lower its prices if it doesn't have to compete against other companies?
Not necessarily, because there are regulations in the current system. If a company just jacks up the price too far, our own government or the USACE does have dredgers of their own, and they'll just try to support themselves.
Okay. And can we agree that basically the moment after the port is dredged, it is slowly starting to fill with more sand and debris?
Sure, yeah, dredging is a process that has to continue over years.
Thank you.
All my chairs ready. And the volume is about ready. Let's get started. What I want to show you in this speech is one primary thing. That is that the narrative of the Affirmative team really lacks current information to back up their claims, and as a result of that, is trying to solve a misdiagnosed problem. Within this speech, I'm not only going to show you that, but I'm also going to show you what the actual problem is, and exactly how the plan not only doesn't solve this problem, but can actually make it worse. Let's start at the top of the flow, though. Begin with an argument about what's a century-old law. My simple response to this I like to write down is affirmative, ignore current improvements. Again, affirmative, ignore current improvements. Now, if you actually think about the crux of their case, it is based upon the idea that the American market, dredging market, simply doesn't have enough capacity. We know that because they won't allow the European dredgers to actually dredge within America unless the American companies are fully completed, if they don't have any more capacity. Here's the problem with that idea. The problem is that the American market is currently drastically expanding, meaning in the future the Europeans either won't come, or if they will come, there's actually really no benefit to them, and America has no effect. I want to support this by looking to more recent evidence than the rest of their case. Marine Lake by Tom Ewing, January 19, 2022, writes this, quote, and I'm going to, just to clarify, I'm going to be reading a lot of different lists from different companies talking about different dredging projects that were actually created within this last few years. Quote, in August, Eastern Shipbuilding Group cut first steel for a new trailing section hopper dredge, and it is building for Weeks Marine. The keel was laid in the following month with the bidder was Allenton Shipyard in Panama City, Florida. It later goes on. Continuing the dredge building boom currently underway, into the U.S. Mason Construction Co. in September, which announced a contract with Capel Am Phelps to build a new hopper dredge at the shipbuilder's facility in Brownsville, Texas. It later goes on. In June, the Great Lakes Dredging Dock Corporation signed a contract with Conrad Shipyard for the construction of a new 6,500 cubic yard capacity TSHT for scheduled delivery in the first quarter of 2023. It later goes on. Also in June, Westlake LA Micros LLC signed a deal with Mobile L Fabricator, Mobile Pulley Works, to design and build a new 27-inch cutter suction dredge. In addition to the new dredge, Hooks and MPW are working closely on overhauling many of the key components to equipment of Hooks' existing fleet of dredges. It later goes on. Galveston, Texas-based dredging contractor Howland Marine announced in July that it ordered a new 28-inch CSD that is due to join its fleet in 2021, unquote. I'm going to stop there. What have we just seen? 5 new projects by major companies that are moving into dredging more ports with more efficient technology and boats. What this does is really undermines the Affirmative team's claim. Because their evidence comes from 2020, 2018, or 2019. They brought up one piece of evidence that actually preceded that, and I'll get to that later because it doesn't support their case. In the recent situation, however, the American industry is improving. Competition and prices are going down. Let's move into the next argument. You can write that down in response to the argument of Americans can't handle the projects. Again, this was 2020, which is, as of now, 3 years ago. My response you can write down is misdiagnose the problem. Again, misdiagnose misdiagnosed the problem. Now they've come up here and made this claim, well, it's because we have the lack of capacity. That's not the current problem. But you may be wondering, what is the current problem? Subpoint A I'd like you to write down as problem is regulations. Again, problem is regulations. The problem is that the regulations of the government are actually harming the work of the American companies. The affirmative team does nothing to solve this. But do I have support for my claim? Yes. The same source says this, quote, it's not unusual that preparatory work, getting a land site disposal permit, for example, or waiting for a beneficial use partner to secure funding, can take longer than the actual dredging, unquote. Let that sink in. The problem in the moment, the reason why we don't have dredging done, is the lack of, or the increasing amount of regulations and permits that are necessary. Now, they might come up in the next page and say, well, we're actually streamlining this process. Well, that's great. That means we're going to see improvements within the future. But their past information, 2020, isn't reflective of the current situation. That moves me on to subpoint B. You can write that down as government causes the backlog. Again, government causes the backlog. It's great to see this in principle, but is it actually this way in application? Absolutely. According to the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, working with the Great Lakes Dredge and Dock Corporation in 2021, and just for clarity, Great Lakes Dredge and Dock is the major company in America, they said this, quote, in addition, a significant amount of our backlog, 62% as in December 31, 2021, relates to federal government contracts, which can be canceled at any time without penalty to the government, subject in most cases to our contractual right to recover actual committed costs and profit on work performed up to the date of cancellation, unquote. What did that piece of evidence say? There's a 62% backlog on this company's work. Why? Because the government isn't actually opening them up for them actually to be done. The problem is not the lack of capacity, they have a backlog right now. In fact, it's the government actually allowing these projects to go through. The impact I'd like to write down is harming U.S. companies. Again, harming U.S. companies. What's an example of this? One more piece of evidence here. According to the Seafarers Law, March 1st, 2023, it says this, quote, as an example, Great Lakes suffered one of its most worst financial years on record because the Corps of Engineers was unable to get major deepening projects out to bid last year, unquote. What does that directly say? Because the government wasn't able to get projects out to bid, that's why they weren't getting money. Not because they didn't have the capability, but because the government wasn't actually opening up these projects. Again, in the recent situation, the affirmative team has misdiagnosed this problem they can't solve. Let's move into the next argument though. He was talking about at-full capacity. Again, this was 2019. My response here though I'd like to write down is not a harm. Cyclical dredging. Not a harm, cyclical dredging. Now, they really misunderstood the concept of dredging here. You dredge it every couple of years, but if you dredge it once, after like 2 months, it's not fully dredged, we're at full capacity. So just because 33% aren't at full capacity doesn't mean we're lacking competition. Let's move into this next argument. That was the plan. My response to the plan in general, I'd like to write down is cause economic disruption. Again, cause economic disruption. The problem in this situation is that if you pass their plan, you're actually risking our ports being in more harm and more inefficiencies than in the status quo. Why? Subpoint A can write down as unions oppose Amy Jones Act reform. Again, unions oppose Amy Jones Act reform. This is according to jurist Dr. Maria Blomhill, April 12, 2013, when it says, quote, in concert with the shipping company themselves, the unions worked swiftly and decisively to oppose Amy Jones Act reform. Even smaller changes that might serve as slippery slopes to reform, unquote. Why does that piece of evidence matter? What is their plan doing? Their plan is directly changing the Jones Act, which will cause the unions to actually go on strike. That could be detrimental to our ports. But it's not just me saying this. Let's move on to subpoint B. Subpoint B is unions can halt supply chains. Again, unions can halt supply chains. Risking this reaction from the unions actually puts the United States ports at a worse situation than they are right now. Scott Lincecum, December 22nd, 2021, in the J. David University of Virginia, the Director of General Economics and Cato's Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies, quote, thus, contentious labor negotiations not only lead to occasional economy-crippling port stoppages, but also longer-term labor contract provisions that intentionally decrease port productivity in several ways, unquote. What is this saying? Passing the affirmative team's plan actually puts the United States economy and ports and supply chain in a much shakier situation than it currently is right now. Let's move to this final argument. You talk about most important dredging projects not done, that's 2018. Just as a quick note here, this says it can't allow the largest ships, not that it's not able to be dredged. So let's move on to the next argument. You talk about crushing the supply chain. My response here is won't make it cheaper. Again, won't make it cheaper. The claim of this argument was that, well, the high cost is leading to a lack of dredging. Their plan doesn't do anything about cheapness. The American companies still get contracts, they still cost a lot of money. This really is a red herring here. Second response, actually let's go on to this next argument, is cost millions of jobs and billions of dollars. Simple response here is a challenge to the affirmative team. No methodology. I would challenge them to bring up methodology to support this point, because what we see in the status quo is that they aren't on the current situation, which means there are problems and misdiagnosis. Thank you so much.
Alright, can all the judges, can you hear me okay? Okay, Josh, you ready?
Yeah, go for it.
Alright, 3 minutes to be started. So why was the Foreign Dredge Act passed initially?
The Foreign Dredge Act was passed in order to protect the domestic industry from foreign companies.
Okay, and does this same reasoning apply to America today?
Yes.
Okay, why?
Okay, the reason why we have the Jones Act in place is for a multitude of reasons, not just related to dredging. It's also related to shipyards, etc. But the basic principle is the same. We need to have a strong domestic market for national security, and otherwise, Brad will be getting into the details of this.
So, but your concern is that by removing the Dredge Act, we outsource the U.S. industry, right?
Not necessarily. There's a lot of ramifications that are going to happen. Just to be clear, the negative team stance isn't to protect every aspect of the Jones Act, but to show how your farm is detrimental.
And just to be clear, with our claim, you are giving priority to U.S. companies, right?
I'm sorry, you're arguing.
Our claim is giving priority to U.S. companies.
You're allowing them their contracts, correct?
Okay, great. Now, your first argument was talking about the idea of how we're currently building ships. How many ships do we have right now in America?
Okay, that number is currently growing, and it also is dependent upon what companies and what projects you're talking about.
Okay, so what you talked about, or first of all, how many ships are we building right now?
Okay, I read this evidence with 5 companies improving their ship supply.
Okay, and so is it your contention that these 5 ships are going to fix the back and corpus Christi that we're losing $50 billion a year?
You can look at a piece of evidence, it's not just 5 ships, it's 5 companies pursuing improvements, but my contention is that we are improving the capacity of America, so yes, we will be fixing the problem.
So is the U.S. industry good or bad?
U.S. industry is improving since the piece of evidence that you read.
Okay, but you also talked about how our biggest company right now is losing money, right?
My argument here is that the biggest company in America is losing money because the government is not opening up the contract. So there's still improvement, there's still competition, there's still new boats, new ships being created, but the government is kind of hurting this project because of regulations.
But in general, it's going to be hard to innovate and make a bunch of new ships if you're not making money, right?
Absolutely agree with that.
Okay, your disadvantage that you brought up in your speech was the idea of unions. So basically, the reason why you made this argument was because unions opposed Jones Act reform, right?
Correct.
Okay, so first of all, why would the unions care about the Jones Act?
The unions have a lot of different reasons why they care for the Jones Act. That spans having a domestic market as well as having good worker rights, etc.
Okay, can we agree that one of the things that unions care about the most is probably maintaining jobs, right?
We can agree that unions care about jobs a lot, but it's not just the jobs, it's actually the quality of the jobs that's directly impacted.
Okay, and whenever we increase imports inside of a port, you're going to need more jobs to fill that port, right?
Not necessarily. It's dependent upon the companies that are actually increasing the imports and whether or not the ports are actually able to handle this, because if not, it's not going to have a beneficial effect but a harmful effect. We saw this just like a year ago when COVID-19 happened and we had barges just stopped, and that caused economic disruption.
Okay, and so, actually, has the Biden administration or has the government in general ever waived the Jones Act for a temporary period of time?
If you want to bring up that argument, you can do so in your next speech. Looks like it.
Because the United States maintains the Foreign Dredge Act of 1906, our ports are left crippled, and in a position where we have no choice but to neglect our most critical ports in America. Ones that are not only helpful for our economy, but also ones that are critical to our national security. The United States is incapable of even doing the bare minimum to dredge these ports, and because of it, Americans suffer. Now, before I get to respond to some of the concerns brought up by the negative team, I first want to bring up an observation, simply that I'm currently 100 times more vulnerable. Again, currently 100 times more vulnerable. This comes from Dredging for America, and it says this, quote, "Indeed, because of this arcane law, the United States is the only country in the world that does not allow the dredgers of NATO headquartered companies to operate in its waters." It goes on to say, the result is that American cities and communities are 100 times more vulnerable to catastrophic storms than comparable cities in Europe and Asia. America's supply chain is significantly compromised because fully loaded modern container vessels and tankers are too big for our ports, and the World Bank recently reported that our 2 largest ports are the least efficient of the 360 ports surveyed around the world, end quote. This is very important. Americans are in jeopardy because our ports are not dredged. Furthermore, our best 2 ports, which are Los Angeles and Long Beach, are the least efficient of the 360 ports around the world. There is clearly an issue and it needs to be solved. But what we see here is when we look at my affirmatives or the negatives arguments, they didn't really refute this idea at all. They started off by basically saying there's a bunch of current improvements and so everything is fine. My one response is that everything is not fine. Again, everything is absolutely not fine. Yes, they built a couple of dredges and they tried to work on some of their companies. That's fantastic. The affirmative team is in great support of that. That's why we support the American industry and we keep them there so they can get contracts first. If they want to grow the entire business, that's wonderful. But right now, they can't meet demand. So their second argument is basically this idea of misdiagnosed problem. Basically, if we're building ships and there's some permit issues, then the problem is completely misdiagnosed. My one response is that no companies to bid. Again, no companies or ships to actually bid on the contracts. Not only did my partner read evidence that really went unrefuted, the idea that port authorities put out contracts and no one bid on them, but furthermore, I have a list here in the actual database from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers of 2022 contracts that shows 393 contracts, 127 were bidded on, the other 266 were not. And I'm going to read you one of these so that you can look at this at the end of the round. This is a Galveston project given in 2022, the Freeport Harbor, Jeffy Channel, and Inside Channel task order. The advertisement date was 9/2/2022. The open bid date was 9/12/2022. This was an indefinite delivery, and there wasn't any bidder. No bidder at all. No one can cover it. That's Galveston. That's one of our ports that's very, very important, and it's important that we do dredge that port. But no one was available to get that done. That was a contract put out and ignored because no one could be there. With that, I want to jump into an actual extra justification for the affirmative plan. Something that's very important for everyone to understand when looking at the actual crisis in America of the lack of dredging. This justification is justification for the status quo threatens national security. Again, the status quo threatens national security. America has a lot of strategic seaports that are very important and designated by the Department of Defense as integral to our national security to move troops, to move resources, and our large battleships. Subpoint A here is that dredging needed for national security. Dredging is needed for national security. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in 2017 says this, quote, based on U.S. Navy dredging and the strategic port needs, it is clear that even if the Corps dredges were not required for on-coast military operations, their ability to maintain the domestic military bases and strategic ports is relevant and in fact represents a national defense need for the dredgers. This is true regardless of whether the Corps normally contracts that work to industry dredgers rather than assigning government hoppers to the projects. This tells us some very important things. First, the dredging of our ports is vital to our national security. If they are not dredged, our military is hampered. But secondly, it doesn't matter who does the dredging. All that matters is that the ports get dredged. But subpoint B is that of undermining military capability. Again, undermining military capability. In the status quo, our ports are really, really critical ones aren't dredged. Chris Tomlinson in 2019 says this, quote, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which Congress charged with maintaining U.S. shipping channels, reports that America's 10 most critical ports desperately need work and American companies cannot handle the job. What did it say there? Our 10 most critical ports are not dredged. Why? Because American companies cannot handle the job. They cannot do it. They need help. Who has that help? The Europeans. But subpoint C takes it even further, and that's specifically the naval base of Norfolk. The naval base of Norfolk is actually flooding because we don't have anyone to dredge it. Tracy Alloway and Josie Weisenthal in Bloomberg in 2022, quote, we have endless projects, and we have projects that will keep all U.S. dredgers in existence now busy. It goes on to say, in Virginia, when they're done with that project of dredging the port, they will still have to relocate the naval base in Norfolk because they did not have the capacity nor the money to come up with a project that would deepen the port of Virginia and save the naval base from flooding. This is very clear. There are three important things. First, we have endless projects. There's so many projects, we can bring everyone in and everyone can have a project if they wanted it. Second, a naval base is flooding. An actual naval base where we have our naval vessels and submarines. It's about 20 minutes from my house. I actually live in Williamsburg, Virginia. It's literally flooding. And third is a lack of capacity. We do not have the capacity to meet the demand, and even our naval bases are suffering because of it. But that leads to the impact simply that the Foreign Dredge Act is dangerous for America. The Foreign Dredge Act in its current form not only does not have a legitimate reason to exist, but secondly, it actually puts forward a national security risk to Americans. But I want to give you an extension to this. This is actually that of long-term national security threat. Again, a long-term economic national security threat. Our economy and national security are intrinsically intertwined. This comes from 16 authors writing for the Wiley Conservation Letters meta-analysis on the environmental impacts of dredging, and they say this, 2018, quote, currently, over 80% of traded goods travel by ship. As world trade grows, the number of ships are expected to increase threefold by 2060. Increasing coastal development and expansion of port facilities to accommodate higher shipping rates and new generation of larger capacity vessels will require extensive dredging services in coastal areas. The impact here is that of no longer the economic leader. We will lose our position as the economic leader because already 80% of goods are transferred by ship. And in 2060, that's going to triple. If our ports cannot take in those massive ships, we will lose our position. But that leads to a solvency. And they kind of argued against this, so I want to bring up a solvency point, simply that of critical ports dredged. Again, critical ports dredged. If we look at an example of when they looked at essentially what would happen if we let the European NATO allies come and join us, what happens? Chris Johnson in 2019 says this. Since local authorities raise half the dredging cost before the Corps seeks congressional funding, work would begin immediately under existing funds. All 10 critical ports could be dredged in 3 years. What do we find here? If we were to waive this, bring in those foreign dredging companies, we can get those critical ports dredged. With that, I want to look to their one disadvantage. It's really this idea essentially that of the economic drop because of unions. My one response is that of 2013. This is 2013 evidence. Furthermore, what do unions want? They want jobs. We give them extra jobs. And furthermore, this is just fear-mongering. We should never make decisions out of fear. Vote for the affirmative, make America stronger, our economy and national security. Thanks.
All right, all my tricks are ready? Mark, let's get started. So how many projects will the Europeans fill if your plan is passed?
Obviously, so there's going to be a lot of projects given out, and more of them given out every single year because all of our ports really need dredged. We find that in 2022, there were about 390 put out. Only about 120 were bid on, so we need about 260 for the Europeans to come and fill, I guess, even this year.
Okay, so it's your contention that this year, if your plan is passed, the Europeans will come and fill 260 contracts. Is that correct?
Of course, not magically they're all going to show up and then dredge all of our ports. It would probably take a while for them to start showing up, but we will see the benefits relatively directly and very, very soon.
Okay, so how many European companies will come and dredge in America?
Yeah, so that's, up to them, obviously. We can't force them to do so. However, they have lobbied not only to come into our ports, but we also find that they are for-profit companies. Their whole purpose is to make money, and if we're going to pay them to do jobs, then they're going to shop and do so. They already do that for everyone else around the world.
And is your contention that there's a long-term need for European dredgers?
There's a long-term need for our ports to be dredged. Right now, we see a significant need that our ports be dredged because there is a backlog.
Okay,
Once
so
our ports are dredged, if America wants to continue to grow to the point where they can take care of it, that's perfectly fine.
Okay, so explain to me how long we're going to need the European dredgers.
As long as it takes to make sure that America can maintain. But it's also the idea that we shouldn't have a ban on our allies. These are our allies who should be able to help us in a time of
Let's
need.
your next argument. You were talking about we're 100 times more vulnerable. Who is the author of that piece of evidence?
So it didn't give a specific author. This comes from Dredging for America, which is an evidence-based resource on dredging.
So, Mark, what was the methodology for that study?
That study on what specific thing?
100 times more vulnerable.
That was specifically looking at the fact that because our ports aren't dredged, there's more sediment nearer to our coast, which means that when there's a storm, it can push farther up.
So just to be clear, there was no methodology for that. That was provided, correct?
I didn't read specific methodology.
And then you later talked about how the dredging need is need for national security. We can just agree that was 2017, correct?
So I think I read 4 or 5 cards under that. There was one card from 2017 where the United States Army Corps of Engineers said our strategic ports are necessary for national security. That's simply a fact. The fact that they aren't dredged was from 2022 looking at the naval base.
Okay, so I'm running out of time. If you can keep your answers low short, that would be greatly appreciated. No worries. Are you aware that U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, or USACE, has their own dredgers?
Yeah, I believe we have 4. They're pretty old, but even so, that doesn't mean we should ban our allies from joining.
And you were bringing up evidence about how we currently have emergencies. Are U.S. aid strategies being used to prevent this?
So they have been used in some circumstances. What we find is that our ports aren't dredged, and there's no reason to ban our allies from helping us.
How many military ports do we have?
Military ports specifically, I believe we have like 48 military ports, but there are over 50 strict, or actually there's 10 critical, very critical ports, but there's a lot of ports that are interfiltrated.
Okay, how many of these military ports are not dredged?
Well, I mean, the naval base in Norfolk is flooding. I don't have specific numbers on all of the rest of the naval bases.
And just to agree at the very end, the prices of the American companies will not be lowered after passing the plan, correct?
If they're going to grow and to innovate and they're going to compete by themselves and they can lower prices, that's perfectly fine.
And one final question, can we agree that the unions do oppose reforms to the Jones Act?
Specifically the Jones Act in 2013, they said something about that. That doesn't mean today, like 10 years later, they don't.
Yes, yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, resuming negative prep time. Stopping negative prep time. 2 minutes.
Alright, is this working okay? It might get a little heated, so. Are my opponents ready? Good. Judge, the hardest thing about not only making this case, because we collaborated on it, but also making negs against this case is trying to find a piece of evidence that is not utterly and completely biased based off of skewed data. Every single TPer in this room feels this pain. And this leads me to my very first point, which you can tag as a response to Mark's argument of no companies to bid. That is, blank does not equal 0 bidders. Blank does not equal 0 bidders. This is really important because their entire argument hinges on the fact that we don't have enough companies actually fueling the market. And they read a study or a database from USA's describing that basically lists out all of the contracts. And there were some blank spaces next to the bidder section, so they automatically assumed that this meant that there were no bidders. I have a piece of evidence to refute this. According to Iowa State University Library, last updated November 10th, 2022, no official published date, it says, quote, "A 0 is not the same as a missing invalid value. The only way 0 should be encoded is with the 0 character, as this ensures that it will be processed as a number," unquote. But not only do I have this very common sense claim that zeros mean zeros, but we can actually look at a past USA's database and realize that they had 0 values when there actually was 0 bidders. So this is a citation for the 2020 United States Army Corps of Engineers contracts awarded database. And if we look on page 1, it's talking about the winning contractor named Goodloe, SBA set aside, service disabled veterans, the district name Wilmington, fiscal year 2020, number of bidders 0. The next one, winning contractor name Manson Construction, number of bidders 0. There's a couple of things we get from this. One, how do you have a winning contractor name when you don't have any bidders? That doesn't make any sense, really, and it pretty much means that this is flawed data. Secondarily, the piece of evidence that my opponents cited from was literally called contracts awarded. All of those contracts, 393 contracts, were awarded because they were under the title Contracts Awarded. This leads me to an extension of the disadvantages. Joshua is going to be getting into the alt-cause in his speech. So you can tag my first argument here as already threatening action. Already threatening action. Now Mark kind of just shoved off the union's DA, but we really need to look at the importance here. According to Augusta Sevilla in December 9th, 2022, quote, but a collapse in talks between the International Longshore and Warehouse Union, representing 22,000 workers and 70 companies, compromising the Pacific Maritime Association, would risk a work stoppage that could snarl U.S. supply chains, still reeling from pandemic-era disruptions and fuel inflation, unquote. So right now, unions are on the brink, probably because Biden actually waived the Jones Act for a period during COVID-19. They're ready to retaliate. Subpoint A is all Jones Act reforms. All Jones Act reforms. The unions are ideology bound to protectionism. They oppose every single Jones Act reform. You know what the precursor to the Jones Act was? It was the 1906 Foreign Dredge Act. My opponents are practically abolishing that. Subpoint B you can tag as historically denied. Historically denied. Scott Lincomb in 2021, quote, unions have also effectively fought efforts by other port operators, especially in the South, to supplement their unionized labor force with non-union workers, a hybrid system that has underpinned robust container volume growth across the region. For example, when the Port of Charleston and the state of South Carolina recently opened a massive new port terminal, the ILA allegedly organized a boycott to dissuade ships from using it because the port hired non-union state employees, unquote. What are my opponents doing? They're bringing in foreign dredgers. We've already had boycotts just because they've had non-union workers working in the ports. This is so much more extreme than what they've already boycotted in the past. The impact is more economic harm. More economic harm. These unions have the ability to shut down, delay, and dissuade ships from coming into ports. They have acted on smaller actions in the past, so they will definitely act in a more extreme action, aka the affirmative team. But now I'd like to have an extension of that unions argument. You can tag my next argument as harming workers' rights. Harming workers' rights. Subpoint A is Jones Act protects. Jones Act protects. According to Blake Jones' law firm, no author was given, on April 15th, 2020, most maritime workers understand that the Jones Act is an important protection for them in the event of an injury in the job. And then it later states, quote, according to the Legal Information Institute at Cornell, the Jones Act affords maritime workers and their families the right to bring a civil claim. This would be the most important issue. Without the right to bring civil action, none of the other benefits would matter. Then it later states, quote, the right to a jury trial. There are many cases where a judge might rule against you, but a jury could understand your situation better and rule in your favor. The Jones Act provides a distinct advantage by protecting the right to a jury trial in a civil claim, unquote. Why is this important, and how does the affirmative team actually affect the Jones Act workers' rights? Well, subpoint B you can tag as European dredgers, not Jones Act vessels. European dredgers, not Jones Act vessels. According to Arnold and Inkin Trials law firms, no date was given. Quote, Jones Act vessels must be registered in the U.S. Our laws require that crew members be American citizens or legal aliens. Cabotage laws, what the Jones Act falls under, requires also that the ships must be built and owned by the U.S. in order to qualify as a Jones Act vessel, unquote. How does this apply? Well, if you are not a Jones Act vessel, that means that you're not going to be under Jones Act law. Jones Act law protects the right to bring a civil claim, to have a jury in that civil claim, and then also to have a wrongful death claim. That's extremely important. Why does it matter? Impact one is harming Americans. Harming Americans. We're requiring 75% of these U.S. crews to be Americans when they won't have rights working in their own country. That is not something any government should stand by. But the second impact is furthering union backlash. Furthering union backlash. Now the unions have yet another excuse to repel and strike on the affirmative team's policy. Not only would they be taking unionized jobs, but they would also be harming the rights of the workers. So the union as a whole has an incentive to strike, but the individual union workers also have a right to strike. This can cripple the U.S. economy. Thank you.
first off, could I just have the evidence you read about the database?
Yes.
Alright, and to basically just start off, should the United States ban our allies from the opportunity to assist us during a dredging crisis?
Yes.
We should ban our allies.
Yes.
Alright, and the reason for that is unions.
Not just unions, but
Okay.
also the fact that the American industry is doing fine right now. No,
Okay, so essentially if we're doing fine, then we should never ever let our allies even have the chance to help us if we were in crisis.
I'm not saying that we shouldn't pass the affirmative team's policy in 100 years. I'm saying we shouldn't pass the policy tonight.
Okay, because we built a couple ships in America.
We didn't build a couple ships. We built a lot more than that. Josh was
You
going to be
believe-
talking about that.
You would agree your partner read 5 examples.
Yes. I would
Okay,
agree with that.
awesome. And essentially argue this idea of unions. Should we make policies out of fear?
You should make policies out of reason.
Mhm.
And when you have an entity in the U.S. that can cripple the U.S. economy, I don't think it's reasonable to
Okay,
fucking fraud.
and so we should basically just, whatever the unions tell us to do, we should do that?
I'm not saying that we should bow down to
Okay,
bad
so,
unions.
so we
but I'm
should
saying
still
that
make, we should still make good policy, is that correct?
we should account for the interests of all Americans
Okay.
and the interests of the economy when
Awesome.
making economic policy.
Alrighty, and so that also means we shouldn't just listen to little groups that are fear-mongering, argue that they can crumble our
These are
economy.
not little groups. They control most of the workforces
Okay.
on basically
And that
every
was,
port.
you read evidence about dredging unions?
No, I was talking about specifically port worker unions or marina workers.
Alright, so the cargo ship, the people who work on cargo ships are going to be mad that Europeans are dredging their ports so that they could actually get their cargo ship into the port?
No, they're mad because you're reforming the Jones Act,
Okay,
something
and
that's critical for their
So,
industry.
so they would be against having their ports deepened so they can actually bring the boat into the.
They are against any and every Jones Act reform.
Okay,
And
awesome.
not having.
And so
borders.
if, basically, essentially, if the United States ever touch the Jones Act, they're going to bring down our economy.
Not necessarily.
Okay,
There's
you would
obviously
agree, you would agree that,
spectrum.
even you mentioned how President Biden or Trump did waive a little bit of the Jones Act during the COVID crisis, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, did the unions bring down the economy?
Well, right now, as I read in my brief, they're literally threatening to strike Biden for doing it.
Okay, so he did make a reform that was good for our economy, and they threatened stuff, but they didn't actually do anything.
They're in negotiations as of this moment.
Okay, awesome. And you talked about this idea of how it's basically we're going to harm workers' rights because of liability laws. You would agree our mandate specifies that liability laws will still be in place.
Not necessarily because you don't specify the Jones Act workers' rights, that's different from liability. The right to
What
bring a civil
what
claim-
other liability laws would you bring up?
The right to a civil claim isn't all liability.
Awesome, thanks.
My turn to read. Before I get into the argumentation, I want to start with 3 main ideas. And you don't have to write these down, but I would be really flattered if you do. The first main idea is growth. Again, growth in the American market. Now, if he was trying to target this across the nation, there's only 5 examples, here's a few more. Richard Balls on January 26, 2021, quote, since 2018, the dredging industry has delivered 2 new hopper dredge vessels and a 35% growth in volume dredging capacity, with 3 additional ships on the way, unquote. Now keep in mind, this is before the piece of evidence that talked about these 5 new improvements. A 35% growth is really important, especially considering that a lot of their evidence, and you can look at this at the end of the round, is from 2017, directly before this date. My second main idea is that we don't have to defend the Jones Act. As a negative team, we're not defending this idea as a whole. All we're showing you is that the plan is not beneficial. Don't let them try to push us into this corner. That's not our stance. Our stance is that their plan is harmful. Third main idea. We are just a summarization, I guess, of their idea. They're trying to help the ports by shutting the ports down. Think about that for a moment. They're trying to help the ports by increasing the amount of dredging by actually harming the unions, which allow the ports to operate. With that said, let's get into the arguments. At the very top of the flow, he talks about observation of currently 100 times more vulnerable. My response to right now is could be from 1906. Again, could be from 1906. If you look at this piece of evidence, there's absolutely no date, not even a copyright date, which means this piece of evidence could have been written the year that the Foreign Jones Act was put in place, or it could have been written 2 days ago. It really doesn't matter. But why does this argument matter? The impact you can write down is app harm unproven. Again, app harm unproven. They could have brought up something from 10 years ago or 100 years ago, and we wouldn't know. And so that means it doesn't mean that we should actually be supporting this argument. That means we on to his next argument. And just to be clear, that had no author and no methodology, so really no reason why you should believe it, even if it was recent. His next argument is everything's not fine, and no companies are here today. My major response here I'd like to write down is majority of projects limited by limiting regs or regulations. I know that's a long time. Majority of projects are limited by limiting regulations. I read 3 pieces of evidence in my speech making this point. How many did Mark respond to? None. This point still stands. The regulations are the reason why the majority of reports actually don't have companies dredging them. Subpoint A right now is evidence unrefuted. Again, evidence unrefuted. Now, even if you disagree with the evidence, even if you disagree with the argument, because Mark dropped the evidence stands. Which means that the reason for the harm is the regulations and not the affirmative team is trying to make you believe. Subpoint B, though, goes a little further. I like to write that down as can't dump material. Again, can't dump material. The problem isn't just that we have regulations, but that we simply can't dredge the material as well. This piece of evidence is from Terrace Housing, 2022. It says this, quote, federal placement sites will not be available to non-federal projects based on need, Clayton said in an email responding to questions. Currently, the course is unable to dredge several locations within the Atlantic Intracoastal Waterway as a direct result of federal placement sites being full and unable to hold additional dredged material, unquote. You can also tag this in direct response to its application of the Norfolk military dredging base, because this is the reason for that. Because they simply don't have the capability to dredge, because there's no place to put the dredged material. This was happening because of that. It's talking about the Atlantic Intracoastal Waterway, which is exactly where this is happening. Their plan doesn't solve, they've misdiagnosed the problem. Let's move into his next argument. He was talking about the national security arguments. He talked about critical ports, the Norfolk base, etc. My response you can write down is unlikely that Europeans come. Unlikely that Europeans come. Even if you disagree with everything else that I've just said, it is absolutely unlikely, improbable, and not economically reasonable that the Europeans dredge in America. Why? Because it's entirely too costly for them to transport their ships overseas to actually dredge in America. It's not just a claim, though. According to Business and Financial Times, Captain Ansar Ahmed Khan, March 17, 2021, quote, last but not least, the cost of mobilization and demobilization of dredges from Europe to America, or any region besides nearby regions, can be expensive or even prohibitive, and is one of the major cost factors in any given project, unquote. Notice that word prohibitive. That means that the Europeans simply can't do it in an economically beneficial manner. So even if you disagree with everything else that I've said, let this point remain. The Europeans are unlikely to actually enter, which means their advantage is completely economically unfounded. Let's move into the next argument. That was the critical ports are not dredged. 2 responses here. The first response is harms inflated. Again, harms inflated. Let's look back to my first mitigation of the responses. I talked about how it only lacks the largest ship and how there's no good claims and there aren't actually studies to back this up. Both of these points were dropped. Both of these points remain. The harm hasn't been founded. The impact is little need to vote half, or insignificant need to vote half. But the second argument you can write down is little benefit. Again, little benefit. Again, let's go back to the cross-examination of my previous speech. This first part is that the prices remain high. Mark agrees to this. The second point is that it's unlikely that the Europeans actually arrive. The final impact I'd like to write down as insignificant reason for affirmative. Thank you so much.
5 minutes, if all the judges are good to go. Good. Brad, Josh, good as well? Okay. Go ahead, Lisa. The last 2 speeches, the negative team failed to respond to 3 main affirmative ideas. The first idea is that at full capacity. Again, at full capacity. They ignored our background point 1, talking about how port authorities have asked for bids on dredging contracts, but none of them can respond because they're operating at full capacity. The second thing that they dropped is that we're currently missing out on 1.6 million jobs every year. And the third thing they dropped is the specific example that we brought up in our third justification, talking about the port of Corpus Christi, how it's losing $50 billion. As the affirmative team, we've shown you a significant problem in the status quo. We are dredging our ports that has severe repercussions on our economy as well as our national security. But the second you side with the negative team, you are nullifying those negative harms to the status quo and you do nothing about it. Therefore, an affirmative ballot is warranted. But let's get into the specific arguments they brought up. The first argument was talking about how a blank doesn't equal 0. 3 responses. The first you can write down is not referencing USACD database. Again, not referencing USACD database. Now, the piece of evidence that they read that said that blank doesn't equal 0 came from the Iowa State University Library website, and nowhere in this entire article, in the part that they read, nor the context of it, even references or talks about the USACD database. It's just a general piece of evidence, so it doesn't actually apply. But my second response you can write down is still lots of zeros. Again, still lots of zeros. I encourage you to ask for the database that Brad handed us over, and whenever you look at it, you'll still see lots of zeros, meaning there are lots of contracts out there that are put out, but no one can bid on them. And the third response you can write down as ignored background point. Again, ignored background point. They once again ignored our background points under our justification of subpoint A, talking about how port authorities are asking for bids, but they can't get them because we're working on full capacity. The next argument was extension of the union's disadvantage. They talked about how they're already threatening action. They talked about historically denied, and they talked about more economic harm. I have two responses. My first is giving unions what they want. Again, giving unions what they want. The affirmative team actually gives the unions exactly what they want. What do unions want more than anything else? They want jobs, and they want to protect their workers. What our plan does is it dredges our ports more. That means that we're able to bring in more imports, which means they're going to get more jobs. That's something that the unions would want. That's not something that they would retaliate against. But even if this disadvantage is entirely true, it's outweighed by our benefits, which is my second response, which is outweighed by add advantage. Again, outweighed by add advantage. Subpoint A into this is no quantification. Again, no quantification. They talked about how we could go on a strike, but they never showed you how severe the consequences would be. On the other hand, we as the affirmative have shown you significant harms in the status quo. How in our justification 3, we're losing out on 1.6 million jobs and losing $50 billion in one port. We can also point out that unions just go on strike all the time. This isn't something that's really unique, and it's not something that's going to be as detrimental to our economy. This isn't a justification to not pass our plan. But moving on to the next argument, it talks about the idea of how our plan is harming workers' rights. Our response you can write down as protecting and mandate. Again, protecting and mandate. If you look back at our mandate, it specifically states that we're allowing these European companies to dredge under U.S. safety, environmental, and liability requirements, meaning that this isn't actually an issue with our plan. Moving on to their next piece, it talks about how there was a 34% increase in dredging. Our response is not increasing capacity. Again, not increasing capacity. This comes from Nicholas Loris writing in 2020. Just to clarify, they read a part talking about a 35% dredging increase. This piece of evidence directly responds to it. It says, quote, "Our repeated claim is that American hopper dredging capacity increased 34% with the addition of 2 new vessels, but the additions have largely just replaced older vessels." End quote. These new ships that we're building aren't actually increasing capacity, they're just replacing old ships. Therefore, the status quo is not fixing itself, and our plan is something that's necessary. The next argument was talking about how it's limited by regulations. I'm going to have a few responses. My first is only an inconvenience. Again, only an inconvenience. At the end of the day, these regulations are just an inconvenience. What we still see is that there's projects that go through the regulatory process, they go through the environmental reviews, they're put out, but no one can bid on them. But then they read a specific piece of evidence talking about the idea of how we do not have dumping sites, and therefore Europe can't come. My response to this is building more. Again, building more. This comes from Coastal Review on October 20th of 2022. Quote, "Approximately 70 to 75 non-active placement sites adjacent to the Atlantic Intercoastal Waterway will be identified, which may also be available for placement of dredged material by local communities, marinas, or other welfare facilities." End quote. So what this is talking about is we're building dumping sites. This isn't actually a problem in the status quo. And then the final argument was talking about how Europe won't come. First of all, I'd like to point out that this is a new argument, but I'll respond to it anyway. Just write down my response as lobbying to come. Again, lobbying to come. This comes from New Orleans Public Radio on March 6th of 2020. Quote, "European dredgers have long lobbied to enter the U.S. market, estimating American taxpayers could save $1 billion per year if foreign firms were allowed to compete with U.S. companies." What we see at the end of the day is that these European companies do want to come to the United States. That's why they're literally lobbying and paying politicians to do so. At the end of the day, we can see a clear harm. The only way that we're going to fix it is by siding with the affirmative team, and therefore we should side with us.
Resuming negative prep time, 3 minutes and 56 seconds on the clock, starting now.
We see the evidence of Bolzano in all union evidence. In the next speech, I'm sure my opponent is going to rattle off a ton of statistics from Cato and Heritage. But here's the issue. What we need to be looking at today is we need to weigh the potential benefit versus the guaranteed harm. All of my opponent's evidence is hinged on the fact that you assume that the author had a good methodology. You assume that the author's number is from the year that they say it's from. The problem is my opponents cannot give you the methodology or the study for any of the data that they presented within this round. That's my first and most important argument, and that is skewed data. Skewed data. When we make an economic policy, we need to make sure that our economic policy is based off of valid and real economic data. Subpoint A is not changing cost of dredging. Not changing cost of dredging. In the next speech, they're going to get up and they're going to say that there's only 2 adequate ports, LA and Long Beach. The problem is that article, in the evidence they literally read, blames it on the high cost of dredging. You don't even affect the cost of dredging. In fact, we have no idea if USAID is going to have the budget to supply the entire US market and then the European market. Subpoint B is contracts were awarded. Contracts were awarded. This is in response to the argument of still lots of zeros and at full capacity. The contracts were literally awarded to 393 projects. That's according to their evidence. The title of that database, the entire point of that database, is that the contracts were awarded. On top of that, just because there's a blank space doesn't mean that there wasn't anybody that won the contract or bidded on the contract, because what we can see is from other contracts from the US Army Corps of Engineers, if there is a zero, they say 0. What does this mean? It proves that the status quo is literally improving, because in 2021, like they said, we had a bunch of zeros, but now there is not one single zero in that database. You can look at all of the pages, you won't find it. Subpoint C is no methodologies. No methodologies. This was my already too long intro, so I think you get the point. The impact here, you can tag as voting on lie. Voting on lie. Their entire argument, their entire case is hinged on the fact that we don't have enough companies and jobs happening in the market. But none of their evidence actually supports this, and all of the outlandish claims like we're going to gain 1.6 million jobs don't actually give any reason how that would happen. This leads me to my next argument, which is in response to outweighed by Affirmative, conceded strike. Conceded strike. In this argument, they conceded that the unions would actually strike. So all I have to prove is that the unions have guaranteed damage. Basically, that striking is damaging. Subpoint A on this is on the brink. On the brink. Not only have they retaliated against smaller reforms in the past, but they're currently in negotiations with Biden because Biden waived the Jones Act. He didn't even change the law. My opponents are changing the law. And what we can see from our evidence is that if they have the power to close the ports, and they've done so in the past, this results in an enormous amount of economic harm, outweighing all of my opponents' harm, because it has actually happened in the past. That's tangible, that's real. Lobbying from Cato really isn't real. Then they were talking about it's protecting the mandate, basically we're protecting workers' rights. My response is not specified, not specified. It says liability law, it doesn't specify the right to bring a civil claim, the right to bring a jury into your civil claim. It doesn't specify any of that. They're using their vagueness to basically dodge around this evidence. Then they were talking about how they had a background point 2, how we're building more dredges. My main response to this is 62% backlog. 62% backlog. We read a piece of evidence saying there's a 62% backlog because the federal government is literally canceling its contracts at the last minute for the biggest company in America, the Great Lakes Dredge and Dock Company. On top of that, we read a piece of evidence that the market grew 35% in 2021, and in 2022, we built 5 new hopper dredges. What this means is that according to their evidence and our evidence, the US market is improving. But what do we know that is guaranteed to happen? We know that the unions oppose any and all Jones Act reforms, and that's exactly what they're doing. Thank you.
Starting 3 minutes for affirmative time.
If our great founding father, Patrick Henry, were here, he would probably say something like this: give me dredgers or give me death. Why? Because the American dredging fleet cannot meet demand, and Americans, all of us, are suffering because of it. I want to start off with responding to this idea of potential benefit versus guaranteed harm. My one response is that a status quo guarantees harm. The only guaranteed harm you have is sticking with the status quo, voting negative and affirming that it's okay to have archaic laws that make our fleet not able to actually protect American ports. But I want to give you a response to this idea of skewed data. My one response is that of don't and won't have capacity. Again, don't and won't have capacity. Here's the issue. They basically said all your data is skewed, so don't vote for it. We brought up about 15 different pieces of evidence on why we don't have capacity, and all their response was is that we're building 5 ships. Here's the deal. I'll give you another one from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This is written by Jacob Plott in 2020. Greg Tosi in 2021, a legislative counsel for the U.S. Senate. Quote, a couple of years ago, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio unveiled a plan to protect lower Manhattan from rising sea levels that, if left unchecked, will eventually require at least 90,000 New Yorkers to be relocated. But the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers said that the project cannot be done without overhauling federal dredging laws. Unlike the dredging fleets in countries like Belgium and the Netherlands, the world leaders in dredging, the U.S. fleet is old, small, and largely obsolete. America does not have, nor can it build, this capacity in any foreseeable future. Here's the deal. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the government agency that contracts out dredging, says we don't have it today and we won't have it anytime soon. There is clearly a problem. But my second response is that it ignored affirmative solvency. They ignored the affirmative solvency that I brought up at the end of my 2NC, or my 2AC, where I explained that in an example of what would happen if we actually waived this for NATO allies, what does it look like? It looks like our NATO allies showing up and dredging our top 10 ports in 3 years. I'll just read it to you again. It says this, Chris Tomlinson, quote, since local authorities raise half the dredging costs before the Corps seeks congressional funding, work could begin immediately using the existing funds. All 10 critical ports could be dredged in 3 years. This is very clear. In an example of what would happen, we find that bringing them in, we already have the money, we can dredge those critical ports. We can protect our economy and our national security by voting affirmative. But with that, I want to respond to this idea of essentially we conceded the strikes. My one response is they ignored my partner's first response. They ignored my partner's first response that we're literally giving them what the unions want. What do the unions want? They want to bring their ships into the ports. What do? We dredge the ports so they can actually have money, that they can actually have jobs. But secondly, we should never ever cower to people like this. We should never ever make decisions out of fear. We should make them out of what is actually sensible for America. What is sensible for America? Reforming the Foreign Dredge Act, because they have still never given us a legitimate reason to ban all of our allies from ever even having the opportunity to help us in a crisis. And that is what the entire affirmative plan is all about. They've still never answered that question. Next, they argue that basically our liability laws aren't specified. My one response is I'm not going to read all the memorandum rights in our mandate. What we know is we're going to keep the liability laws, and all of them. We're not going to have to name every single liability law that exists in the status quo. And finally, they argue this idea of 62% backlog, and basically they call it double dredges. Here's the issue. We appreciate the fact that America's building dredges. In fact, we really, really appreciate it, and we want it to continue. That's why passing the affirmative plan is good. Because ultimately, the question we should be asking is, should we ban our European allies from joining America? The answer is no. Voting issue 1 from the affirmative is that national security undermined. National security is currently undermined in the status quo 100%. Voting negative is saying you're okay with that. Subpoint A is that of current need. The current need is very clear. We literally have naval bases that are getting overrun, that are literally having to be moved. They're flooding because we don't have any ship to meet the demand. But second is that a future need. Again, future need. They never responded to the extension I presented that in the future, when the amount of boats we need triples, America will no longer be able to be the economic leader, which means we fall from our mantle as the military leader. That destabilizes America in a very large way. Voting affirmative is the only way to solve it. The impact is that it necessitates reform. It necessitates reform. Voting issue 2 is of severe economic harm. Again, severe economic harm. At the end of the day, because our ports are not dredged, the evidence is very clear, we lose millions of jobs and billions of dollars. The impact is that no reason to stop European allies. There's no reason to tell them no. But voting issue 3 is that an illegitimate law. This is an illegitimate law that has not been given an actual reason to exist today. For that reason, the impact is that the Foreign Dredge Act is principally wrong. On principle and for America, it is wrong to have the Foreign Dredge Act in place in its current form.